Thank you for your invitation. It's good to be here. I bring greetings from Bovey Baptist to you all. If you have access to a Bible, it'd be good to open it in the book of Esther. There's some around, I believe. It'd be handy to have that book open because we're going to kind of move around within the book. We're not going to stay just in one passage, so it might help to have that open with you. When I was asked to speak, I think as Michelle said, you okay to speak on a set passage? I said, yep, that's not a problem. Happy to do that. What is it? It's the book of Esther. Oh, yeah, book of Esther. I can remember thinking, no worries, I'm happy to do that. Many of us will be familiar with the book of Esther. And as long as you get chapter 4, verse 14 in for such a time as this, you're sorted, aren't you, with the book of Esther? You're sorted. But as often is the case when you engage in God's word, the more you engage in the book, in the story, in the characters, the more unsorted you can begin to feel. And I found it was raising all kinds of questions and issues for me. If you've got your the Bible open, you can scan down chapters 1 and 2. Issues of gender inequality and abuse. King Xerxes is a man with absolute power. And he has this 6-month-long look-at-me fest. And at the end of that, parading his possessions and his wealth, he throws a 7-day party. And at the end of that, he decides he wants to show off one more of his possessions. Well, that's Queen Vashti. And Queen Vashti has been throwing a party of her own. And so when the demand of her boozed up husband comes through, she just point blank refuses to go. It looks like Queen Vashti doesn't want to be shown off as one of his possessions, paraded as property. But he's not a man who's used to the word no. You get that impression if you read through the book. And so Vashti is out on her ear. And the great and the good think, well, you don't want that attitude catching on throughout the land. So they get the king to kind of issue this edict around the empire where a man should be the ruler over his own household. Don't know what you think of that, but that's what they did. Chapter 1, verses 9 to 20. Just let your eyes scan down through and you'll pick it up. Why abuse? Why did I say abuse? Well, you've got this situation where young girls from all over the kind of empire are gathered up and then they're sifted and they're sorted, ready to be taken to the king's harem. And Esther is one of those. She's the orphan raised by her cousin Mordecai. She's one of them. And like the others, she's taken to a place, one part of the palace, and after being kind of prepped and preened, she waits until it's her turn to go and have sex with an older man she's neither met nor desired. And following that, she would go into a different part of the palace and never see the king again unless the fancy took him and he called her by name. That's chapter 2, verses 8 to 14 again. Let your eyes scan down through. It's all kinds of questions beginning to raise. We're only in the first couple of chapters. There are questions about systemic and endemic racism. When Esther finds favor and she is made queen, Mordecai, her cousin, says, keep your ethnicity under wraps. Don't tell him you're Jewish. And this caution is borne out when one of the king's advisors, Haman, who's the kind of villain of the piece in a way, feels slighted that Mordecai won't kneel before him and show him the respect that Haman thinks he's due. He's climbed the ranks and he thinks he's owed some kind of respect here. But Mordecai doesn't give it to him. And Haman wants to get his own back. He wants revenge on Mordecai. He wants to avenge his slight. But he doesn't just want to do it on Mordecai. He wants to wipe out all the Jewish people, not just in Susa, where the palace is and a lot of this takes place, but throughout the empire. You see, by this time, most of the Jewish people who had been taken into exile in Babylon had returned home. But a residue remained in the strange land of Psalm 137. And Haman talks the king into issuing a decree, an edict, giving permission for people to rise up against their Jewish neighbors on a certain day and kill them. Some of the inhabitants of Susa are a bit bewildered at this edict, but no one objects. If you look at it, no one objects. The king is obviously indifferent toward them and their fate. He says, do what you want with these people. Do what you want with these people. Royal permission is given for people to kill their Jewish neighbors and to take their property simply because they are Jewish. It's not so much about religion, it's about race as much as anything else. See, Haman takes offense at one person, but now a whole community of people are made to be an offense to their neighbors, and it's driven by wounded pride and enabled by the indifference of power. Chapter 3, verse 10 and 11. You can pick it up there. And this is made all the more kind of galling, if you like, by the fact that it's Mordecai, the one of those condemned people, one of those to be disposed of people, that actually uncovers a plot against the king and saves his life. And so the sense of injustice as we read kind of creeps up another notch. So we find intrigue, we find plot, we find violence, we find hatred, we find manipulation, and as we go on, we'll find courage and victory. But what's the one thing we don't find in the book of Esther? It's God. Any mention of God. Strange book in the Bible with no mention of God. And I think that's the overarching question of the book. Where is God? Not one mention of instruction, of his leading, of his interjection. In the midst of threat and powerlessness and uncertainty, it appears that God is nowhere to be found. Where is God? And I think it's the question we are meant to ask as we engage in the book of Esther. Why? Because it forces us to go deeper in pursuit of him. Where might he be? How might he be present and at work in this situation that's getting worse by the minute? And it also forces us, if you like, to think about our own reaction and our own responses in those situations and circumstances where we are wondering where God is. Many of us will have known that experience of questioning the Lord. Lord, where are you in this? Circumstances give rise to a feeling that we are very much on our own. That we can do that as individuals, but we can also find ourselves doing that as a fellowship, a community of God's people. When we find ourselves in a certain place, a place of uncertainty, an in-between place, the place where nothing seems to be clicking, nothing seems to be coming together for us as a fellowship. Times when the leaders don't seem to have any more idea of a way forward than anybody else does. Times when our gathered worship doesn't seem to disturb the dust on the shelves, let alone raise the roof off the building. Times when we don't seem to get that sense of his presence in the way we used to. Lord, where are you? Times when there is that collective question, Lord, where are you in this? It may not always be spoken, but in those times it will be there somewhere. Lord, where are you? There may be some of us here today who are starting to wonder whether he's here at all. So what do we find when we look a little deeper in pursuit of the presence of God? Well, what we find is kind of hints, coincidences that as you go through start to look less like coincidences and more like the unseen hand that is weaving threads together as part of a bigger picture. Don't you find it interesting that out of all the girls in the empire who have been sifted and sorted, it's Esther who finds favor with everyone she meets, including the king. Out of all the girls who could have been made queen, it's the powerless orphan, one of the hated people, who is raised to the place of influence. It's there in chapter 2. Look at verses 17 and 18. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Coincidences. There are some more of these coincidences in chapters 5 and 6, if you want to turn there. It's here we find the kind of pivot point around which the fortunes of the Jewish people begin to swing. In chapter 5, Haman has managed to put in place this royally approved destruction of the Jews. But he has a particular hatred for Mordecai. And spurred on by his friends and his family, he has something special in mind for Mordecai. It's a huge gallows on which to hang him. But let's look at chapter 6, verse 1 and 2. On that night, so this is the night when Haman is coming up with all these plans. At that night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found recorded there that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? Asked the king. None. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. The king said, well, we'll get to that bit in a minute. But don't you find it interesting that it's on that particular night, on the very night that Haman is cooking up this plan to unleash extra hatred on Mordecai, when he commissions the building of this massive scaffold to hang Mordecai on? Don't you think it's interesting that it's on that night that the king is deprived of sleep? He could have asked for wine, couldn't he? If you follow the book, it looks like he has a portion for a pint or two. He could have asked for entertainment, but he calls for the history of his reign to be read out. And it's here he's reminded of how Mordecai has uncovered a plot against him. And again, it's on this very night that Haman is planning Mordecai's destruction, that the king is thinking about how to honor Mordecai. Now look at verses 4 to 6. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on a pole that he had set up for him. See, on the very night the king, when Haman is planning all this, the king is deprived of sleep and Mordecai is brought to his attention. On the very night that Mordecai is brought to his attention, Haman is then in the court, wanting to speak to the king about hanging Mordecai ahead of the mass slaughter of the Jews. And yet it's then that the king instructs Haman to honor him. Coincidence, isn't it? Or is it? It's interesting that the very manner of honor and status that Haman is kind of setting up for himself was then given to Mordecai. Coincidence? Maybe. But look at the reaction of his family when Haman gets home. Haman's not happy about this. He's got to parade Mordecai around the city, and people give Mordecai honor and homage, and Haman is kind of fuming. And he gets home. It's chapter 6, verses 12 to 14. Look what happens when he gets home and tells his family what has happened. Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. And he told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Notice this. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Interesting, isn't it? The chapter before, they were goading Haman on to do something wild and wicked to Mordecai. It's another one of these coincidences. Or is it? Maybe a coincidence, but remember, all this kicks in after Mordecai has persuaded Esther to risk all and find a way of speaking to the king. It's in chapter 4. All this kicks in after Mordecai and the Jews throughout the empire had been wailing and weeping and laying in sackcloth and ashes and fasting. They had been fasting when they heard the news, seeking God in fasting. All this kicks in, this great kind of pivot point kicks in after Esther had called the extreme fast for the whole Jewish community in Susa. Don't eat or drink anything for 3 days, and then I will go to the king. See, all this pivot point kicks in when Esther is prepared to give all for the sake of the community of which she is a part. Chapter 4, verse 16, "I will go to the king, and if I perish, I perish." The tables are turning. Coincidence? Well, this leads us into another question. See, what do we do when we can't seem to find God? When we can't seem to hear his guidance or feel his presence? When we can't feel his presence, we should behave as though we can. And when we can't see he is with us, we behave as though he is. Now, it's not about denial or about deluding ourselves. It's actually about faith. You see, in the uncertain place, in the in-between place, it's our belief that will shape our behavior, both as individuals and as a fellowship. What we believe about God will shape our behavior in God's world. The truth of God's presence doesn't rest on our perceiving of him to be present. It rests in the truth of his promise to be present, doesn't it? Our behavior does not rest on being able to feel his presence. It rests on our believing in faith that he is true to his promise. In John 14, Jesus is preparing his disciples for the fact that he is going to leave them. A part of that preparation is the promise that he would send the Holy Spirit. As his disciples, we have the promise of the indwelling of God himself in and through the Holy Spirit, don't we? Now, when we're getting that kind of lift in worship, when we find ourselves, every time we open the Bible, there's a great new revelation that comes at us. You know, when our prayers seem to soar beyond the building and up into heaven itself, most of us don't have a problem believing God is present. He's with us. He's for us. But when our reading seems dry and dusty, and our praise doesn't seem to get beyond the end of our boots, and the heavens are as brass, it's then that the questions of his presence start to rise. Whether as individuals or as a fellowship, our behavior in the uncertain place, in the in-between place, will be shaped by our belief. In chapter 7 of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus encourages us to ask God. Why? Because he will answer. To seek God. Why? Because we'll find him. To knock. Why? Because God will open the door to us. The issue is, do we believe it? Do we believe it when we come to prayer? Do we believe it when we come to seek God? Do we believe it? See, if we do, we will pray in the knowledge that God has heard and in the faith that he will answer. If we don't believe it, then we may speak words with our mouth, but there will be no expectation in our hearts. So why is behavior shaped by faith important? Well, it helps us work with our last question. And it's this. What is the relationship between human action and God's sovereignty? There's another question that arises out of this book. Why do I ask that? Well, if you go through, it looks like things work out because of human planning. Things work out because of human wisdom and thought. It's Mordecai who kind of pushes Esther to step in. It's Esther who comes up with this 2-day banquet plan to pick her moment and reveal that she is part of the community condemned under Haman's edict. And so she also is in peril. It's Mordecai who comes up with the content of a new edict that enables the Jews to defend themselves. It's the Jewish people themselves who take up arms, and it's they who have to do the fighting. So it's easy to think God is not involved in any of this. But look what happens. Chapter 8, 17. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebration. And many people of other nationalities became Jews because fear of the Jews had seized them. It goes on, 9, 2-3. No one could stand against them because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the king's administrators helped the Jews because fear of Mordecai had seized them. It's quite a turnaround, isn't it? The vulnerable, the weak had now become the strong. And it seems like as the people do their bit, then God has somehow done his bit. Behind the scenes. And again, we get one of those hints in chapter 4, if you want to go back there, verse 14. Mordecai's word to Esther. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Is it about putting pressure on Esther? Yes. But it's also a statement, a conviction that they will be brought through this by God's unseen hand, isn't it? Where do we go? What do we do? How is God trying to lead us? Have you ever been in that place as an individual or as a church meeting? You got a church meeting coming up. Prayer times. Lord, where are we going? What should we do? And the truth is, there are 101 things you could do, and none of them would be necessarily wrong or bad. And it's in that place sometimes you just can't get any kind of divine lead or hint as to which one is the right one. But when we are stuck in the car park of what we could do, we need to step out onto the road of what we know we should do. Sometimes it's only when we do that that a more defined path becomes clear. We need the conviction that God will be at work. We can't see it, Lord. Doesn't matter. We need the conviction that he will be at work. You can't steer a stationary boat, can you? You need water flowing over the rudder before the master can steer a course. When there's 101 things you could do and you get stuck, do what you know you should do. God's bit, our bit. In Ephesians 6, the Apostle Paul talks about putting on the spiritual armor for protection against spiritual attack. God has supplied it, but if we want to avoid getting flattened by the enemy, then we need to put it on. God's bit, our bit. Chapter 13 of John's Gospel, Jesus says, "Love each other as I have loved you. By this, all men will know that you're my disciples if you love one another." When all these options are before you about what you could do and you're stuck, do what you know you should do. And trust God that he will do his bit. God's sovereignty, our activity. Apparently it was William Carey who said, "Expect great things from God, attempt great things for God." There's a relationship there, isn't there? And in relation to the question of God's bit and our bit, it doesn't really matter which way round you have that statement. Now, I don't really know you guys as individuals. Just met many of you first time this morning. I don't really know what's going on for you as individual people at the moment. I don't really know this fellowship. I don't really know where you are at the moment or where you think you are even. But in preparing this, I just really got the sense that for some, it feels like an uncertain place. A time of uncertainty, an in-between place. A place where at times God seems conspicuous by his absence. But I believe the encouragement today is that God is where he has always been. And you just need to believe in the truth of his presence again. I believe the encouragement today is don't let the question of what you could be doing keep you from doing what you should be doing. I believe the encouragement today is if you do your bit with integrity and expectancy, God will do his bit. See, the book of Esther ends in a very different place than where it began, doesn't it? Come and lead us, guys.